How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiaga, live today on Tuesday, July 16th. We're getting closer to football. Today, some more teams had their rookies report for their first days of training camp. Football's right around the corner. To go along with that exciting news, I got some exciting stories to get to on today's episode. A lot of breaking news sort of today. Brandon Aiyuk that is, requested a trade officially from the San Francisco 49ers. We're going to get into that in the first segment. Then we are going to be reacting to ESPN's top 10 quarterbacks that they released a few days ago. Then also we're going to talk about Derrick Henry signing, obviously, with the Baltimore Ravens, why the Ravens feel that they could still get the best version of Derrick Henry despite him being 30 years old, and the running backs and the narrative around them as they go into their later years. Scares away a few teams, but the Ravens have a good response to that. Those topics and more coming up on today's show. Before I get started, please remember, if you have any questions or comments, to use the tip and donations link, gsmcpodcast.net, that you see there on your screen. By using that link, I'm able to see your question. It'll pop up in my chat box. I'll read it on air, and that way we can maybe swing the conversation a different way. Just get your guys' thoughts on anything I say or on any of the topics. It's a big help for the show and the network as well. So if you guys would, please use the tip and donations link, gsmcpodcast.net, whenever you feel the need to say something based on what I say or on the topics. But with the biggest news coming out of the NFL today, Brandon Aiyuk has officially requested a trade from the San Francisco 49ers. I don't want to say I told you so just yet, because this, for me, means a lot, but it could also mean not too much, just based on the reality of everything, because according to NFL Media's Mike Garafolo, he was the first one that I saw reported on this topic and said that obviously Aiyuk requested a trade today from the San Francisco 49ers, and in his tweet, he said, After an offseason of unsuccessful attempts to reach an extension, despite a recent meeting, the Niners haven't been willing to engage in negotiations since May, so Aiyuk has respectfully asked out. And that's pretty shocking. I didn't really know it was since May, but according to Mike Garafolo, the negotiations haven't really moved that much since the month of May, and it is surprising, but also I've been on this show talking about how I feel pretty confident, pretty adamant that I don't think this is going to get resolved. And you can only imagine if you're Brandon Aiyuk trying and saying publicly that you want to be a 49er, ideally you want to stay here, but they're not reciprocating that same energy. You know, if they're not really pushing towards anything further since about 2-3 months ago, you're starting to feel, if you're Brandon Aiyuk, like, all right, this isn't really going anywhere. At what point do you realize that you're almost wasting your time if the other side isn't really reciprocating that same energy? So I'm not too surprised that Aiyuk requested a trade. That being said, it could be used as a ploy also on the other side to just apply more pressure to still stay with the 49ers. But I think this has some deeper meaning to it, not just as another ploy for Brandon Aiyuk to maybe just apply some pressure to the 49ers. I really think that we have reached a milestone here with Brandon, just because this comes during the week of the 49ers starting their training camp. Their rookies, the rookie class, and all the new players actually reported at training camp today, and the veterans aren't supposed to be there until next Tuesday, a week from today on July 23rd. So you have a week now where you're really going to get into the full swing of things, and with Brandon Aiyuk to really sound the alarms everywhere, and sound the alarms not just for the 49ers if that was his main goal with all of this, but for everybody else around the NFL, that, you know, it's come to a point right now before training camp where I'm saying I'm really now publicly looking for other options outside of the 49ers. Because before, why I think this is so important is because before, if you recall that Pivot podcast that I talked about and some of the quotes he said, it was, ideally, I want to say with the 49ers, this is where I want to be, but if I had to choose, I'd go to the Steelers or I'd go to the Commanders. I'd love to play with Jaden Daniels, something like that. But it was always rooted in the fact that his first option was the 49ers, but now I feel like Aiyuk has come to this point where it's not looking promising. He has not gotten the same level of hope and enthusiasm really from the 49ers to pay him what he feels his value is at. So now he's sounding the alarms for everybody in the NFL to maybe not only get the 49ers a better sense of urgency, but for other teams to say, all right, now he's thinking about moving on. He's requested a trade. His first option might not be to stay with the 49ers. Let's pick it up here and start approaching the 49ers with our trade offers, because now they don't feel like they're wasting their time, right? Now their hopes might be reignited that Brandon Aiyuk and the 49ers are really not going to come to an agreement on a contract extension. So now you have more teams that need a wide receiver approaching the 49ers. So I think right now where this stands, again, I mentioned before that it means a lot for all those reasons that I just mentioned, but it could also not mean too much because, as you would have expected, ESPN's Adam Schefter reported right after the news dropped that his sources say that the 49ers still have turned down teams trying to inquire about a trade for Brandon Aiyuk. They're very reluctant to trade him. They're not looking to trade him, even though he has requested a trade. They don't find it in their best interest to do that. And it is a similar case, or was a similar case, I should say, with Deebo Samuel a year or two ago when he was trying to get his contract extension done, but it wasn't really moving too progressively with the 49ers. So he also requested a trade. If you want to go further back, Robbie Gould, their former kicker, also requested a trade, but both of those situations ended up with both players staying with the 49ers and getting their contract extensions. So you look at that situation, and this is almost following very similarly to those two. So if you're a Niners fan, if you're anybody following this situation, it could just be more of the same with the 49ers. And George Kittle actually brought this topic up before when I was looking at an interview he had, I think on the Rich Eisen show. He mentioned that he was confident that Aiyuk was going to come to an agreement with the Niners because it has shown in previous cases with himself, with Deebo he mentioned, and even Nick Bosa, that the 49ers usually take a long time and sometimes carry it, or more often than not, carry it into training camp and very close to the start of the season when it comes to these important players getting contract extensions. So really, the fact that Brandon Aiyuk has requested a trade and that we're about a week from the official start of training camp and no deal has been, ironed out yet, it's almost not news because it's happened already before with these other big players that the 49ers have. It's just almost their way of doing business. They feel confident at the end of the day that they could get something done. And it could be the same case here, but also if we just reference back to the Deebo situation and Nick Bosa situation in particular, I think in those two instances, the 49ers weren't really dealing with the fact that they have to figure out all these other contract extensions right now that they do with Brandon. One, with Deebo, the wide receiver market was nowhere near what it is now. If Deebo was trying to get paid this year, or maybe next year or something like that, it probably would have taken a lot longer than it did because the wide receiver market has just exploded in this offseason. And also with Nick Bosa, they were reluctant to do it, but I feel like they showed more of an urgency when it came to Nick Bosa, that they really didn't want to lose him. And I think with Brandon Aiyuk, I can't be the only one that has noticed that their actions, re-signing Christian McCaffrey, bringing back Juwan Jennings, and things like that, don't matter when you're still trying to figure out something with Brandon Aiyuk. If he sees that, of course, Christian McCaffrey is important. Juwan Jennings played a big role in the Super Bowl and leading up to it. But if you're Brandon Aiyuk, you also put a lot into this team. You contributed a lot to the development of Brock Purdy as well. So if you see these other guys getting paid a lot of money too for a running back in today's market, you're starting to feel a type of way towards the 49ers of why am I taking so long if you're handing out all these other extensions. But, they have other things to deal with. Like I mentioned, other players like Dre Greenlaw, Diamador Lenore is coming up, his contract extension, one of their key secondary pieces. You also have Brock Purdy. Also, he's going to get a lot of money next offseason. When it came to Deebo, George Kittle, and Nick Bosa, you really didn't have to deal with these other markets, especially the quarterback market, because that one's obviously the most expensive one. That's really hindering these negotiations and why I believe this one's a little bit different. It is taking longer like the other ones did, but the difference here is I believe that it just has to do with the circumstance and having to pay Brock Purdy next offseason most likely. hot take, Brock Purdy is the best Mr. Irrelevant. I am not too familiar with, formidable Mr. Irrelevant. I guess that does just help the case for Brock Purdy being the best Mr. Irrelevant. Even though I'm not too familiar with it, I can't imagine too many of them have gone to NFC championships, have gone to the Super Bowl so early on in their career. So it is a hot take, but it's still pretty fair to say, I believe, just because Brock has been drafted into a great situation, has been surrounded with all this talent and credit. Not enough credit goes to Brock Purdy, honestly, in these quarterback conversations. Yeah, his team is stacked, but I believe that he contributes a lot more than a lot of people give him credit for. So it's a hot take, but I would agree with it. I don't think it's that ridiculous to say. But to just close out the situation with Brandon Aiyuk, like I mentioned, with training camp starting next week, this could almost pretty much guarantee that Brandon won't be there if he's already requested a trade. And some other tweets came out after the news from Mike Garafolo. Jeremy Fowler tweeted from one of his sources that Aiyuk wants to be traded or paid, but San Francisco doesn't want to pay him or trade him. So not too much movement there. CBS Sports' Josina Anderson said that New England has actually reached out to the 49ers, but were declined as well. And just to wrap it up, I think the favorites to me still remain the Washington Commanders. The relationship he has with Jaden Daniels, I think, is huge. They spend a lot of time together this offseason. You can't tell me that hasn't played a major part in Brandon Aiyuk with the FaceTime call and spending all that time with him. That doesn't affect him deciding where ideally he wants to play next. And also, I keep saying it, I don't hear anybody else talking about it. Keep an eye on the 49ers, no, not the 49ers, the Commanders' new general manager, Adam Peters. They brought him in from the San Francisco 49ers. He was their assistant general manager in San Francisco. Now he's the official general manager in Washington. So those previous connections, those previous relationships, that not only Aiyuk, but members of that organization, John Lynch, Kyle Shanahan, keep an eye on him. And if a deal does get worked out and Aiyuk is traded, don't be surprised if you see Adam Peters and somebody like Adam Schefter or Mike Garafolo or Ian Rappaport saying that he played a major role in that, because I believe that, going along with Aiyuk spending all his time with Jaden Daniels, and I'm sure Jaden's communicated it to Adam Peters as well, don't be surprised if you see that Adam Peters played a major role in getting this deal over the line. That's my personal hot take on all this. I think that plays a huge role in this, but I don't know. It could be big news. I think it is. I think it just supports my stance that I've been saying all along this offseason, that Aiyuk is going to get traded. I don't see this being resolved. As long as it's taken, I think the writing is clearer and clearer on the wall that the 49ers just simply can't do it. They might want to do it, but with all these other things they have going on, it might not be in their best interest to pay Aiyuk top of the market money if they have to do the same with Brock. They've done it with Debo. They've done it with George. They've done it with Nick Bosa. It just can't physically happen with the salary cap. So we'll see where this goes from now. We'll keep track on it, and I'm sure I'll talk about it in the next episodes. I see a comment. I will get to it after the break. I have to go to a quick break right now, but on the other side, I will address that comment, and also we're going to talk about ESPN's quarterback rankings that just came out. Some surprises, but not too much when they pretty decided quarterback rankings, but we're still going to react and analyze it after the break. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit. A stupid myth, you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh,
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Jumping right back into the action on today's show, before I get to ESPN's quarterback rankings that I wanted to react to, another comment here says, CeeDee Lamb, Micah Parsons, one out if the Cowboys don't at least make it to the NFC Conference Championship game. I think it's fair, but maybe not just if they don't make it there. I think CeeDee Lamb, I can't speak too much on Micah just because I think his contract negotiation talks aren't really heating up right now. There's still some time there, but with CeeDee Lamb in particular, it almost boils down to the same thing as Brandon Aiyuk. The Cowboys are taking very long to do it. Obviously, CeeDee had an amazing year for them. He's a big part of their team. But again, the circumstances that surround that team, with Dak wanting probably top of the market money, CeeDee Lamb deserving top of the market money, Micah probably getting top of the market money as well, similar to the 49ers, and where the salary cap situation is with the Cowboys, they've already had to make some tough decisions. With 3 of their best players wanting top of the market money, something's going to have to give. I feel like one of them is going to have to leave. CeeDee Lamb is holding out right now. I don't expect him to be there at camp. So he's the one right now where I would feel like if I had to pick one to obviously leave or want to request out, it would be him, just because right now it seems a little bit icy between him and the organization. But similar to Aiyuk, the negotiations are moving slow, and I think some frustration is starting to build up there based on that. But we're going to get to these quarterback rankings. We're going to get to ESPN dropping some more of their positional rankings. Yesterday, they released their top 10 quarterback rankings based on the responses and input from NFL executives, some of the coaches, and some of the scouts around the NFL as well. They've already released their running backs. I talked about them a few episodes ago. They've released the safety rankings, the offensive tackle, interior linemen, and edge rushers, and tight ends so far. A lot of them, I didn't really address them because they were pretty self-explanatory, not too controversial or anything like that, but the quarterbacks were a little interesting, so I thought I'd bring it up on today's show. And jumping right into it, going from 1 to 5 as you see on your screen, Patrick Mahomes, not too surprising, at 1. Then you have Joe Burrow, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson at 4. Matthew Stafford there to round out the top 5. And I will move to the second half before I analyze it. 6 to 10, we have Justin Herbert, then C.J. Stroud at number 7, above Aaron Rodgers at number 8, then number 9, Jared Goff, and rounding out the top 10, Dak Prescott. All but one of the 80 people that were approached by ESPN voted Patrick Mahomes at number 1. Pretty self-explanatory, no surprise there, but it was one of the comments made on Josh Allen that really riled up a lot of people in the media. One NFL executive called Josh Allen one of the more overrated players in the NFL because of turnovers, and that really got a lot of people riled up about it. But I don't know. I'm a fan of Josh Allen, but I think it has been pretty unfair with him just playing the Chiefs constantly, getting the short end of the stick most of the time on freak incidents that happened with the missed field goal and the plays at the end of the game to Tyreek Hill and getting that field goal off to send it to overtime. It's been pretty ridiculous what has happened to Josh Allen, but I see you guys commenting on this topic. Rich Diaz says, I disagree about ESPN NFL Network. 49ers are a good team, and the haters know that the 49ers are a good team. It's just the haters don't like us, but it's okay. The 49ers keep looking forward. It's hard to argue with that. I think the 49ers are a great team. People like to discredit Brock, but again, I'd give him more credit than most people do around the NFL. Also, the best running back in the league, Christian McCaffrey on the 49ers, is one of the best running backs. No argument there. The best tight end, George Kittle, the best quarterback in the league, 2 on the 49ers, has number 2. Josh Allen, number 10 in a quarterback from Baltimore, number 8 on the Rams, number 12. Prescott, no way. Dak Prescott at number 10 as a top 10 quarterback. I probably wouldn't have him there. If I'm honest, just because I've wanted to fit in Jalen Hurts into these rankings. If I were to make these rankings, it's hard to argue with any of them. There are some questionable ones that just, raise my antennas a little bit. Dak Prescott being one of them. And since you mentioned it, Rick Diaz, I will start on that one. Dak Prescott at number 10. A lot of people have him higher than I do personally, just because, he has, I think, progressively gotten better more and more over the years. I think he's been one of the reasons the Cowboys have been so successful in the regular season is because we've seen the development from Dak over the last few years. Last year arguably was his best year. They had one of the top records in the NFC, but it obviously comes down to the playoffs where people start to separate themselves, and Dak just hasn't done that, and that's been the biggest the biggest critique around him is just that you make it to the big dance, you make it to where all the good teams play, but then usually you just don't perform up to standard. And a lot of times it's not like the Cowboys or their defense plays bad. He has been known, or recently in these last two games, to throw some interceptions, some questionable decision making. And from that point on, it's hard to really continue to overly say that Dak is one of the top quarterbacks when he just doesn't perform to that level when the lights shine brightest. But that's my biggest critique. Some of the honorable mentions that we're going to talk about right now in regards to this list, to some that could have made it on the top 10 list, are Brock Purdy, Jordan Love, Jalen Hurts, Tua, Kirk Cousins, and Trevor Lawrence were all some of the most notable honorable mentions in ESPN's list. They just missed the cut by a little bit. And now I'll get to some of the takeaways. Other than Dak Prescott being on the top 10, elsewhere on the list, seeing Matthew Stafford at number 5 surprised me a little bit, just because I felt that he was one of the more underrated guys in the NFL in terms of quarterbacks. So to see him at number 5, I just didn't think people held him to that high regard. But over the last few years, I think people have started to turn that corner a little bit more with Stafford, just based on wins and losses surrounded with the Los Angeles Rams. Just outside of arm talent as well with Matthew Stafford, he has the wins and losses to support the reason and the value that he brings to the Los Angeles Rams. Because if you look at the last 3 years, in 2021, the Rams go 12-5 and win the Super Bowl, obviously in Stafford's first year. Then in 2022, he misses 9 games, and the Rams miss the playoffs completely. They're a shadow of themselves without Matthew Stafford. And then last year, he only misses 2 games, and the Rams are back in the playoffs, and they played a good game with the Detroit Lions, but they couldn't get it done at the end of the day. But that just shows you how much he is valued, how much his presence and him just playing out there for the Rams, having him as their starting quarterback, makes that much of a difference. Similarly to Joe Burrow and the Bengals, maybe not to the level of AFC Championship games, but when he is there, this Rams team is formidably way better than they are when he's not there. They look like a completely different team. It's funny that both of them wear number 9. I'm just realizing that from the picture. But that surprised me a little bit, just how high regard that these executives, coaches, and scouts hold Matthew Stafford recently. And also elsewhere, Jared Goff in the top 10 also, again, caught me off guard a little bit. But the difference with him, from what I read in the article posted by ESPN, is that he has outplayed all the critics and all the naysayers recently around him. From the time he was traded to the Detroit Lions and everything bad that was said about him, he has really proven a lot of people wrong over the last few years to not only play better himself, but to take the Detroit Lions, this young team, and be the leader of that team and take them this past year to the NFC Championship game. I think has caught a lot of people off guard, has pleasantly surprised a lot of people. So that, in combination with just personally having great numbers himself, has earned him a spot in the top 10. A good reason why he was paid this offseason as one of the highest paid quarterbacks, because of how much he means to the Detroit Lions. So him in the top 10, I wasn't really expecting it. I feel like people are more enamored right now with the freshest, the newest quarterbacks on the block. I honestly probably expected Jordan Love to be in there over a guy like Jared Goff or Matthew Stafford, but it looks like people value Jared Goff a little bit higher than I was expecting. And just overall, if you look at the rankings from the top 5 guys on the list and then the bottom 5 guys, you really see that the biggest divider with those guys and how they're ranked is just the playoff performances. You look at Patrick Mahomes, you look at Joe Burrow, Josh Allen, even Lamar and Stafford. They've all had that big moment in the playoffs where they either win the game for their team or they're just a big contributor in getting their team over the hump. Josh Allen has been unlucky to play the Chiefs so often and come out on the wrong side of winning and losing, but he has consistently been the driving force for the Bills team. Then you look at the Bengals. When Joe Burrow is there, they've made it to AFC Championship games. When he's not there, they've missed the playoffs, so not much to be said around there. Lamar, just now turning that corner. He gets to the AFC Championship game. He falls short to Patrick Mahomes, but you can see that development in Lamar and finally having those sustained, consistent performances in the playoffs. Patrick is Patrick, Super Bowls, MVPs, Mr. Clutch, just does everything for the Chiefs, so obviously he is at number 1. And even Matthew Stafford, playoff performances, going to the playoffs in his first year there with the Rams, winning the Super Bowl, I think has him there at that number 5 spot. And then you look at the bottom half of that list and how it's divided. Justin Herbert has made it only to the playoffs 1 time. CJ Stroud, same thing, but he's young. He's only in his 2nd year. Rodgers as well, for how historically well he's talked about in comparison to Tom Brady, the Peyton Mannings of the world. To have him at number 8, I know the age plays a big factor in that, but also you look at that playoff record, the recent playoff performances, and it doesn't really help his case. That's why I believe he's probably so low at number 8. For how talented he is, you'd expect better performances in the playoffs, but you've just not gotten it out of him. Jared Goff has recently just, gone back on that train of playing better in the playoffs, but again, hasn't really done enough yet. He has a good window here with the Lions to, climb those rankings a little bit, but I can see him at number 9 as a fair spot. And at number 10, same thing with Dak. Some of the executives, and I'll round it off with this, actually said that because Dak needs support in big matches, he's not quite good enough to elevate his team on his own, is a main reason why he is good enough to be in the top 10 just based on his performances in the regular season. But because some executives, some coaches, some scouts believe that he can't elevate his team, he can't be the driving reason why they win a game as to why he is the last player on the top 10 rankings. And also, one executive said that he is very good, but not quite at that elite level, like some of these other quarterbacks on that list. And it's hard to argue with it, but I think that's a pretty fair assessment. I think more has to be done maybe around him with the Cowboys if he decides to stay with them. But for what we've seen so far, Dak hasn't been able to do it himself and really step up in those moments where the team needs it. And that's unfortunate for how it's gone out with the Dallas Cowboys and him and their relationship. Maybe it's run its course. Maybe he just needs to move on and perform better elsewhere. I'd like to see that. I feel like it would be interesting, but the Cowboys and him are still working out contract negotiations. But that's pretty much everything I had to say on the ESPN Top 10 Quarterback Rankings. Pretty interesting ones, but pretty self-explanatory at the same thing. Other than Jared Goff and Matthew Stafford being ranked at number 5, I think this is a pretty fair list with how well CJ played. Justin Herbert, still very talented. I think people feel a little bit more empathy for him for what he's had to deal with coaching and team-wise. I feel like he's that good, but I think it's starting to come to a point where he needs to prove it a little bit more. But that were the rankings. Leave your guys' thoughts in the chat box. If you agree with them, if you think somebody was left out that shouldn't have been, leave it in the chat box or in the comments section after this episode. But we're going to head to another quick break on the show, and when we return, we're going to talk about the Baltimore Ravens and them signing Derrick Henry, why they believe that Derrick Henry can turn back the clock and still put out great classic Derrick Henry performances, even though he is at the age of 30, an age that scares off a lot of teams, but the Ravens are very confident in Derrick Henry's abilities. I'll go more in depth on that when we return after this break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Jumping right back into the action on today's episode, we're going to focus in on Baltimore and them signing Derrick Henry, one of the big name signings I think this year because of who Derrick Henry is, because of how good the Baltimore Ravens were this past year. It made a big splash this offseason when they signed him to a 2-year, $16 million deal. Henry, one of the best running backs in the NFL, clearly in recent years, has, put out great performances on a very disappointing Tennessee Titans team. So it wasn't a surprise when he decided to move on and the Titans went into a full makeover, bringing in Brian Callahan and just changing that entire identity heading into 2024. But with Derrick Henry, there were some questions just because he was hitting a free agent market where it hasn't been so favorable to running backs really over the age of 27, 28. And now Derrick Henry has just recently turned 30 in January and is coming off one of the more shaky seasons in his standard from his levels of performances in 2023. But with that being said, ESPN's Jamison Hensley published a story on Baltimore's new running back in Derrick Henry and just mentioned how in 2023, Derrick Henry's rushing yards per game were 68.2 and his yards per carry were 4.2 as well. And those were his worst numbers in those two categories since 2018. Just to go along with the fact that maybe the relationship with the Titans wasn't working out anymore. It was time for him to move on, and that's exactly what he did. But again, with that being the case and his age of 30, some people started to, roam into the area, roam into the idea that maybe Derrick Henry is finally on the decline with his age and with the fact that he has a very physical style and not a lot of running backs really last in the NFL playing that style, especially at that age of 30. But with that being said, to rebuttal that, he still recorded over 1,100 yards last year, 12 touchdowns during a season where, again, going back on that Tennessee Titans idea that maybe the rest of the team was just not up to standard. He had 106 rushes last year where he was contacted by the opposing defense behind or at the line of scrimmage. 106 times he was handed the ball. A defender touched him before he even reached the line of scrimmage or he was just at the line of scrimmage. And that's pretty telling, not about Derrick really, but just how hard he really had to work for those 1,100 yards. So you get a little bit of good and a little bit of bad with Derrick, and I think that just makes this signing a bit more puzzling and a bit more confusing to work out, just because you can point to the fact that he is older and that he might be declining, but also you point to the fact that the Titans weren't that good. Their offensive line wasn't one of the better ones. It was actually probably one of the worst ones in the NFL. And now you bring him over to Baltimore, and the offensive line in Baltimore compared to Tennessee, even though the Ravens lost players like John Simpson, Morgan Moses, and Zeitler on that offensive line, I still think that even with those departures, you could argue that that line is probably just as good or still better than what the Tennessee Titans were working with in 2023. And just the identity around that whole team. They had DeAndre Hopkins, but it was on a very short notice. He didn't really have enough time to really get integrated and make too much of a mark in Tennessee. You had a new quarterback coming in, and it just looked like the initial steps were being taken in Tennessee to rebuild that whole thing. And Derrick, being 30 years old, wasn't going to stick around for a whole nother rebuild. So they were already sort of moving on into a new direction. It wasn't looking good for Mike Vrabel also. So I think that piled on with the fact that Derrick just really didn't have a great year based on his standards. He had to move on. Now we find ourselves in Baltimore, and those questions are still present with Derrick on whether or not he's really going to make that type of Derrick Henry impact where it can get the Baltimore Ravens over the AFC Championship hump that they were stuck on last year, because really that's the measuring stick now for the Ravens, I think, with Lamar playing as well as he did last year, Mark Andrews coming back healthy, Isaiah Likely looking very promising, Zay Flowers hoping to take that next step in his second year. You have a lot of exciting prospects. That defense is still pretty formidable, led by Roquan Smith. They lost some pieces, but I still expect them to be pretty solid. You set that standard already that so many people were waiting for the Ravens to reach with Lamar Jackson. Now that you've gotten there, you bring in a guy like Derrick Henry, and you're going to be measured with getting back to the AFC Championship game, because not only the fact that you did it last year, but last year they were so dominant with the running game. A lot of people are just going to expect Derrick Henry to come in combination with Lamar Jackson and that read option. It's going to be a nightmare on paper for any team to stop it. But ESPN's Jamison Hensley commented on the fact as to why the Ravens really felt that they had something going here with Derrick Henry despite his age. Hensley said that Baltimore believed that Derrick Henry has enough left in the tank to complement Lamar Jackson, not so much be a 1A or a 1B to Lamar Jackson, if that makes sense. So Derrick is coming in really just to amplify Lamar, not so much be a three-headed monster like the situation in Houston, to say, right? You have Tank Dell, Nico Collins, and Stephon Diggs, all able to be 1A, 1B, and 1C type of wide receivers, or a situation maybe, I'm trying to think in terms of running backs, maybe I guess the Steelers, just two running backs that could arguably be 1As on a lot of teams. That's not what the Ravens, according to ESPN's Jamison Hensley, that's not what the Ravens have too much in mind with Derrick. They really just want him to complement the game plan, the idea, the scheme around Lamar Jackson, with Lamar still being that focal point. For him to come in, complement Lamar, earn those hard-earned yards in first down, second down, and then make it a little bit easier for Lamar on third downs, maybe fourth downs, to run the ball, and just be in more comfortable situations to establish that run game early with Derrick, and just making it overall easier for Lamar, because I think it's a good strategy to implement now. It wasn't something that I was expecting. I was of the mindset that Derrick was coming in and being that guy to be that 1A to Lamar Jackson, because I think a lot of people by now have been expecting the Ravens to bring in a number one receiver for Lamar Jackson, somebody that he could throw the ball to, maybe get him to expand his limits, I guess, as a quarterback, for a lack of a better term, in the passing game, because that's the first thing you think of with Lamar is his running ability, not only because he does it better than everybody else, but just because the Ravens haven't found another passing option outside of Mark Andrews to really complement Lamar Jackson up until this point, and I think that's hopefully where it gets to at some point. Hopefully they bring in somebody to do that, but with Derrick Henry now coming in, they feel like they've found something to amplify this running game and amplify that part of Lamar Jackson's game to where it's going to be good enough for them to get back to the AFC Championship game, ideally, if this plan does work out for them. And it's still curious just because Derrick is of that 30-year-old range, and again, that age right now scares off a lot of teams that are looking for young, new running backs to complement this new day and age of passing game, doing a lot more in that regard. And Derrick isn't the biggest pass catcher out of the backfield. He is capable of doing it, but that just wasn't his role in Tennessee. I'll be interested to see if they try to implement that more into his game in Baltimore to get more out of him. But again, at 30 years old, I had some doubts bringing it up now about the Ravens bringing him in at 30 years old to really try and get the best out of him and try to get him to take this offense to the next level. I have my questions if he could still do that, quite honestly, if he is capable of doing that, but the Ravens seem pretty confident in doing that. And also, just the fact that he's getting paid $8 million per year makes it easier for them to bring on a 30-year-old running back. But whether or not he's declining, I think injuries is one of the main reasons why people point to the age for running backs. But he hasn't been too injury-prone at all, really, in the last few years, where you start to see more injuries pile up for running backs. So that's a great thing for the Ravens. And obviously, the main reason why I think the Ravens are comfortable with doing this is because of Lamar at the end of the day. Since being drafted in 2018, no other quarterback has rushed for more regular season yards than Lamar Jackson. So if Derrick Henry is only being brought in to complement and amplify that part of Lamar Jackson's game and not have to produce 1,200 yards, 1,300 yards from scrimmage or rushing, then I think you can get by with this strategy, just because I think Lamar has earned the benefit of the doubt of being one of those quarterbacks, like we just finished talking about, to amplify the rest of his team and make the rest of his team better in situations where on paper they might not stack up, but just because they have Lamar, I think they've earned that benefit of the doubt to know that even though they lost Zeitler, Morgan Moses, John Simpson, and you're a little bit weary on Derrick Henry, Lamar still finds a way to get you over the hump and win you ball games in the regular season, definitely, and in the playoffs coming off of this past year. So right now, the Ravens are putting a lot of stock, I think, in Derrick, because that's really been their one major signing that they've made this offseason to try and improve, with the Chiefs getting better, Joe Burrow coming back to the Bengals, the Texans getting better. The Ravens haven't done too much, but just add Derrick Henry, and that was questionable, like we were just talking about. So the Ravens' belief in Lamar is going to be a big role in how he is complemented by Derrick Henry, and whether or not the Ravens are just good enough to exceed the narrative around the old running backs and them not being able to contribute to a team, a contending team, in 2024. They have a good case on trying to beat that narrative, but I think the trial is still out on that. I'd have to see it before I truly believe that this team can get back there, because the AFC is just so tough. The AFC is so competitive, and it's only going to get better this year. So we're going to see where the Ravens go with this offense in 2024. But we're going to head to a quick break. We have two more topics to talk about on today's show. Some statements that were made, one by Cam Heyward. He revealed some of the pieces of advice that he gave to Russell Wilson that got him to sign with the Pittsburgh Steelers this offseason. And also, Nick Sirianni talked about some of the changes to expect from this Eagles team also heading into 2024. So stick around. We're going to get into both of those statements from Cam Heyward and Nick Sirianni when we return in just a few seconds.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
We are back here now on the show to talk about a couple of statements that I thought had some precedent here in the NFL in regards to some of the bigger topics and some of the bigger things that surrounded this offseason. Obviously, one of the biggest stories was Russell Wilson signing with the Pittsburgh Steelers, and after the fact that he did sign, some reports and some sources came out that said Cam Heyward and Mike Tomlin were some of the biggest contributors to getting Russell Wilson to sign in Pittsburgh. And this happened back in March when the reports came out about Mike Tomlin and Cam Heyward. But really from that time up until now, Cam Heyward recently revealed that he actually had a little meeting, a long conversation really with Russell Wilson leading into him actually signing with the Pittsburgh Steelers that I thought was really interesting on how we broke it down, especially with all the context going around with Russell Wilson, how everything broke down in Denver, his relationship with Sean Payton. I thought what Cam Heyward said to him, some piece of advice, whether or not he was going to sign with Pittsburgh at that time, I think really helped him find a clearer picture for how to approach the rest of his career going forward. And I actually had the quote here pulled up to show you guys as well. Here is the advice that Cam Heyward gave to Russell Wilson. He said, "And then I came back to my room and me and Russ just talked for about 2 hours. We talked ball. I know he was having conversations with the Steelers. The main thing I told him was just, this isn't the place for glitz and glamour. It's not LA. It's not Atlanta. This is the place where the gladiators come." And he also pointed out after that statement that Russell Wilson was very receptive of this idea, very receptive of what Cam was trying to get across in his message to him and their conversation, what he was basically trying to say to Russell Wilson. And this quote was actually from Kay Adams and her conversation with Cam Heyward. So apart from almost this being taken as a slight warning, because obviously the rumors around that time were pretty strong with linking Russell Wilson to Pittsburgh. So this might be seen as a warning or just as a, I don't know another word to use other than warning, honestly. But with Russell Wilson and all the negative things that were being said about him, you could look at Cam Heyward's statement and say that he was almost, just foretelling Russ that you better act this way or else. That could be taken on how some people interpret this quote, this statement from Cam Heyward. But really, at the end of the day, I think this was just more done so Russell could just really understand what he was stepping into in Pittsburgh, because Pittsburgh is not just another place like Cam Heyward referenced, like a Los Angeles or a Atlanta or these other places where, yeah, there are expectations, but because of what the Steelers represent, the organization and the history of that team, it's not so much about the outside stuff, the outside noise with whoever you are as a player. You sort of have to leave that at the door when you step foot into that organization and realize that what you're playing for, who you're playing for, especially in Mike Tomlin and that organization, goes a lot bigger and is a lot bigger than what you're bringing in as a player on a personal level. And Cam praised Russell Wilson's, apart from this statement, Cam also praised Russell Wilson's attention to detail, from doing all the little things as a veteran, right, doing it the right way, and setting a good example for the young players that they have now. Obviously, that is after the fact that he signed. So now that Russell Wilson is actually a quarterback for the Steelers, albeit on a 1-year deal, now you look at that and you can analyze a little bit more. And this is where my mind sort of went in regards to this statement and in regards to what it meant to Russell Wilson at the end of the day. Why Cam Heyward said it like this is because that glitz and glamour comment that he made could stem from the off-the-field stories with, like I mentioned, Sean Payton, the Denver Broncos, the "Let's Ride" slogan that was made popular, then turned into a meme, and then all that stuff that surrounded Russell Wilson and how funny, how corny it was to some people, and just trying to bring that attitude to the Denver Broncos and then ultimately turning out how it did. That's the sort of things that I think Cam was trying to avoid and trying to get Russ to understand that they don't need any of that. They don't need Russ to be this character, because he is portrayed as this very wholesome, good guy that says all the right things, can do no wrong, can be a little bit corny, but Cam was really just trying to get the best version out of Russ in this statement and this piece of advice that he gave to Russell Wilson, because you could see how Cam would want to limit that stuff, because when Russell Wilson signed that massive deal with the Broncos, he was doing all that media stuff, and even Sean Payton, I think, pointed out at one point, he obviously didn't say it with the right tone or anything like that, and it came out a lot worse, but I think he mentioned it a while ago with Russell Wilson, that he doesn't have to be this poster child, this golden boy to the NFL, to how he is portrayed in the NFL. He doesn't have to be that. He almost, at least at that point, in Sean Payton's estimation, cared more about how he was viewed and how everything he said in media, he was almost like trying to be liked by everybody around the NFL and around NFL circles, in media especially. And Sean Payton really didn't like it, and of course he didn't say it the right way, I believe. It came across more harsher than I think he probably meant it to, but the message I think wasn't too far off, and I think the way Cam said it was a little bit better to get Russell to understand that all that stuff, all the promotions and ads that you had with the Broncos, all of the comments that you made, all the headlines that really were made from that time in Denver wasn't going to really slide in Pittsburgh. If he really wanted to be serious and try to revitalize his career in Pittsburgh, he had to leave all of that at the door. And I think up until now, with how reporters and sources close to the Steelers have talked about Russell during camp and things like that, it seems like he has taken that approach to heart and has taken that as a good opportunity now to really focus in on this, hammer down, and really just get back to the best version that he can be, or that the Steelers at least believe he can be on the field in 2024. Now, that period with the Denver Broncos has cast a lot of doubt in a lot of people's minds on whether or not Russ could ever be that player we saw in Seattle. I'm hopeful as a Steelers fan that you could at least get some resemblance, maybe not so much of the Russell in Seattle, but of Russell last year with Denver. Not too bad of numbers, actually better than average around the NFL. And that, to the Steelers and what they had to deal with at quarterback, could be seen as a top 10 quarterback walking into their building based on having the play of Kenny Pickett, Mitch Trubisky, and Mason Rudolph. Having the numbers and level of production that Russ produced last year, I think is game-changing for the Steelers in all honesty. So that's another reason why they decided to sign him. And just because of their poor recent performances, Cam, going back to his statement, I think it's just clearly trying to get everybody locked in and on the same page with this team, because they don't want to, throw it away. They don't want to waste this opportunity because they have such a great defense. Their offensive line is getting better. They have great playmakers. Cam obviously notices that, and I think not just Cam, but everybody in that locker room is getting to a point where this playoff record, this playoff drought that they constantly get reminded of every year when they're in around the playoffs, or they're in the playoffs, or they're trying to get in the playoffs, is starting to, tick a lot of people off and annoy a lot of people in that locker room, because it's been almost 10 years since they've won a playoff game. So honestly, they're too good to have that record. They are too historic of an organization to have that record on their resume recently in the last few years. So that, to go along with what Cam said, I think that's the main message. And going back to yesterday's episode about Cam Heyward hating the fact that they were on Hard Knocks, I think all of that extra stuff Cam Heyward is not the biggest fan of. And he's really trying to limit that this season, because I think there's a lot more expectations on the Steelers now, because the quarterback can be used as an excuse now, because you definitely got better in Russell Wilson and in Justin Fields. So if they're not performing up to standard, it's got to have to be this other stuff that Cam Heyward is trying to limit. And by trying to give Russell Wilson this advice, I think it will help him. It will try to limit that during this 2024 season. But how they execute it and how they perform on the field is almost a completely different thing. But I am of the mindset that it will help if everybody is just locked in. And I think that's ultimately what Cam was trying to do. Get everybody on the same page. Get Russell to try and understand what their mindset is heading into 2024. Because it is a big year, I believe, for the Steelers. And they have to perform, or else I think more changes are just going to come after this season. And the talk is going to get louder around this team if they don't start performing to the level that their players are considered in and around the NFL. But that pretty much does it for what Cam had to say to Russell Wilson in that statement. We have one more thing to talk about on today's show. Some more statements made by Nick Sirianni on the changes coming to the Philadelphia Eagles just off of last year, on how disappointing it was and what to expect from this new look Eagles team in 2024. So stick around. We have one more thing to talk about regarding Nick Sirianni and the changes coming to the Philadelphia Eagles. Thank you for joining me on this last segment on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to go over what Nick Sirianni said on some of the potential changes coming to the Philadelphia Eagles this year. Obviously coming off of the bat of a very disappointing end to the 2023 season for the Eagles, going on that losing streak and just getting beat down, quite honestly, by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Left a very bad taste in their mouths. You know, they moved on. Or I shouldn't say they moved on, but Jason Kelce and Fletcher Cox moved on. They decided to retire. So there's a new, fresh feeling to this Eagles team that the veterans sort of moved on, and now you head into this new era where you bring in two new coordinators as well. It's actually the third consecutive year that the Eagles have had two different coordinators come in on the offensive and the defensive side of the ball. So there's a lot of change coming already from that fact this year in 2024. But Nick Sirianni recently gathered a few of the Eagles reporters to discuss some of the various topics around this offseason and mainly some of those changes that we are expected to see, I think, with the Eagles, because the Eagles are in a weird situation where if any other team performed like they did last year, major changes should be expected, and you'd expect maybe Nick Sirianni to face some more pressure, be on the hot seat potentially. Jalen Hurts be under a lot more scrutiny this year to prove that he is and belongs in that top tier of quarterbacks in the NFL. But because of the fact that they added Saquon, they added Devin White, they brought back C.J. Gardner-Johnson, they drafted very well this year, that pressure has almost sort of melted away, or I don't feel as worried about this Eagles team to not deal with that pressure because they've done so well already to address some of their biggest needs in free agency. None bigger, I should say, actually, than Saquon Barkley. But Sirianni addressed some of the changes that people want to see. I've already mentioned it a lot in this segment already. Changes. People want to see a reaction from this team, but Nick Sirianni has kept it a little bit more cautious in his approach to changing things this offseason. He said, "I just think it's really important we don't overcorrect. Will there be changes? Yeah, there will be changes like we do with our defense. There will be changes like we do with ball security. There will be changes like we do with offense. But I think we have to be very careful not to overcorrect." And I think that's super interesting because on paper, this Eagles team is very good. Very good last year with A.J. Brown, Smitty, Jalen, Dallas Goedert. This team, their offensive line as well, and DeAndre Swift had probably the best year of his career. On paper, they should have been a lot better than they were, but there was just a lot of outside factors like the coaching fiasco, the coordinator fiasco, some of the just misunderstandings that you had between Jalen and the play calling and just what the receiver was supposed to do in regards to the quarterback. It just looked very sloppy and very unlike the Philadelphia Eagles coming off of a year where they made it to the Super Bowl. And not only did they make it, they played very good and had a good chance of winning that game. To follow that up with what they did in 2023 towards the end of that year and just a complete 180 to the first half of the 2023 year, it left a lot of people confused of how, poorly they played, especially in the red zone where they were very inefficient. So people want something to happen. People want to see reactions, and the Eagles have done that. Nick Sirianni has said that there will be changes, obviously like the statement says, but to try and not overdo it with changing too much of what Devontae Smith does well, what A.J. Brown does well, what their identity is in running the ball, especially now bringing in Saquon Barkley. I think they want to keep certainly some of the things that they did well around, but not be too trigger happy to just change things for the sake of changing things just because you want to satisfy people telling you that you need to react in this sort of way or react doing this. I think it's a very calm approach by Nick Sirianni to do it because, again, a lot of people will point to him as one of those changes if the Eagles don't drastically improve in 2024. But on top of that comment, some of the other things Nick Sirianni talked about was focusing on last year more because of how it ended. Yes and no because of how the season obviously went, but he did accept that they need that they did have more time to evaluate this past season because of the fact that they exited early from the playoffs, but he's excited to get to work on those changes and see and just really spearhead those changes that are intact, that he has alluded to in the statement that he said. He's had a lot of time to think about it. He has had a lot of time to really focus on how they ended last year and try to correct that going into 2024. He also mentioned and spoke about the topic of changing the offense and the foundation of that offense, if that makes sense, with the arrival of Kellen Moore, really going away from his offensive identity, because before Kellen Moore came in, Brian Johnson and Nick Sirianni himself, the offense was built around their idea, their mold of how they saw it. But now, obviously coming off of last year, it didn't look right at all, and it didn't look efficient, it didn't look clean. There was a lot of misunderstandings, like I mentioned, a lot of confusion, a lot of finger pointing, a lot of false starts, and it just looked sloppy, really, at the end of the day. And now, this year, with Kellen Moore coming in, that idea of changing that offense that he is so familiar with and sort of relinquishing the lead on calling the plays on offense could be hard for Nick Sirianni, but he said he's just really approaching that situation with the best intentions for the Philadelphia Eagles as a team. Forget what he wants to do and the kind of offense that he wants to run. He felt that bringing in Kellen Moore on this team is what the team needed, even if it's hard for him personally to go away from that offensive identity that he really loves. He wants the best for this team, and he wants the best play calling. If it does require him to take a step back, he is willing to do that to at least get this team back to where they should be based on the roster that they have, especially now with Saquon Barkley on the team. And also, similar to that topic, he mentioned, he spoke about the level of control he might still have in regards to that offense with Kellen Moore coming in. He said that he has taken a step back, sort of like a CEO type of coach now, where he's overseeing a lot of different aspects, maybe contributing more on defense, contributing more in the passing game, the running scheme, and things like that. He's not so focused in on play calling on the offensive side of the ball per se. He said he's taking that CEO approach now, but is still focused on overlooking everything and overlooking certain things like the culture that he wants to establish as the head coach, because he is still the leader, the face of this team as the head coach. So he is really still focusing in on trying to establish that culture, getting everybody to be detail oriented, and just focusing on the little things about this team, and how it all just works out big picture wise, not so much micro, with the Philadelphia Eagles. Ryan Santoro said, "Do you take dynasty questions?" I will take it. I might need you to elaborate more so on the dynasty question, but you can go ahead and ask it. I'll do my best to answer it in regards to your question before the show wraps up here. But just overall on these comments and the takeaways that I took from Nick Sirianni and talking about the changes with the Philadelphia Eagles, going back to my initial point about the Eagles and how weird it is on how they're approaching this year, Nick Sirianni has seemed pretty calm about how he is approaching heading into 2024 and how he's focusing in on trying to address some of these changes. He seemed very calm in some of the answers he gave, and just very, what's the word I'm looking for? He just seemed very unbothered by some of the questions that were coming his way about the rumors about Bill Belichick. Do you think there's more pressure on you now because of how it ended last year and how badly it looked? He gave some very just calm answers, like he wasn't playing for his job at all. And that was pretty fascinating to see. And I think it just stems from the fact that, again, this roster is built to be in the NFC Championship game, arguably to be in the Super Bowl with how good they are just everywhere you look. Quarterback, offensive line, running back, wide receivers, tight end, defensive back, with how well they've drafted and who they brought back as well. This team, I think, is so just stacked. It's like an all-star team that I think at the end of the day, with Nick Sirianni, I think it stems from the fact that he knows he has a good team. He knows that he has the luxury of having all these great players it should be easier and there shouldn't be that much pressure on him to try and get this team back to what they were, because they've only gotten better since then. They've only increased their probability of being in the NFC Championship game if they could just iron out some of the sloppy amateur mistakes that they made with the false starts and not having everybody on the same page. If they do that, I think it's going to be probably a great year for this Eagles team. I don't see them really struggling at all, because they were 10-1, I think, at one point last year, and then they went on that losing streak. So I have confidence in them. I think Nick Sirianni should as well, with how well they've rebuilt this offseason. And Ryan Santoro said, Dynasty, Superflex, win now roster. Would you send Josh Jacobs for Debo? I also have Aiyuk, or do you think I should wait on that trade until we see if the Niners honor Aiyuk's trade request? Thanks. Yes, this is just me. I'm more of a play it safe kind of person. So I wouldn't send Josh Jacobs for Debo just yet. If you have Aiyuk and you think that waiting on a trade until this whole thing plays out, I think it just similarly plays into just my experience with fantasy and things like that on drafting certain players. I want to see where all these guys that I'm really investing in looking into are heading, what their plan is. Like similarly to a guy like CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Aiyuk, or some of these guys working out with contract extensions, Tua as well. I need to see what the situation is looking like, especially when it comes to contracts, because they could hold out. They could just not be there, and then when they start the season, they're cold. It's not looking well. I would definitely hold off on that trade because we're talking about Debo, Josh Jacobs, and Brandon Aiyuk and how it relates to everything. Those are very formidable players that will, have an impact on this season and things like that. So I would definitely hold off to see where this goes from now, because I think it will heat up a little bit more as we head into training camp. We should get some more answers when Kyle Shanahan is being asked about it, John Lynch, and all the other teammates as well. And I'm sure Brandon Aiyuk won't keep quiet while he's holding out. We're going to see it speed up here, I really believe, in training camp. So hopefully you won't have to be waiting too long to get an answer on that. But I do appreciate your question on that topic. But on that question, we will wrap it up on today's show. I want to thank you guys for joining me on today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show, as well as following the network on all forms of social media. And if you want to see more of this show, check out the GSMC Podcast Network channel and the GSMC Sports Network channel on YouTube for a lot more types of content around the NFL as well. As a final reminder, tune in every weekday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time for more football conversations and NFL discussions with me, Manny Maradiaga, as your host. Thanking you for joining me on today's episode, and I hope to see you guys back here with me again tomorrow.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn.